Again, we got Miss Maritza Perez with us this evening. We're going to talk about policy. At the beginning of this, we're also going to do some intros. Maritza wants to know where you all are from, where you're located, campuses. We've talked in the past just about even on campus, on your respective campuses, different rules that you all have that don't even align sometimes with what the rules are in that state. So we're here to talk about that, how to better and be an effective organizer, and tips from somebody who's been in the trenches, who's been doing the work with the MORE Act. We're going to talk about CAOA, which is the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. So yeah, we're going to get into all of that this evening. Make sure you buckle up. We'll do some housekeeping at the end. And besides that, Maritza, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm so excited to be here. It's so good to see everyone.
Awesome. Let me go ahead and get ready to share my screen and put this in present mode. All right. Let's do this. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
We're good. All right. All right. So Maritza Perez, Director of Office of Federal Affairs for DPA. Again, that's Drug Policy Alliance. I will be updating the glossary as we go this evening with terms. But if any pop up in your head as we go along the discussion, please drop them in the chat so that we can go back and make sure we cover all the terms that everybody has a question about. Besides that, Maritza, I'm going to pass it over to you. Please.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for this. Yeah, thank you so much, DJ. Well, I thought before we could start, I could hear from everyone. If you don't mind introducing yourself, where you're based, and what brings you here tonight, where your interest lies. So I don't know the best way to do this. I think just because it's a small group, whoever wants to start can start and then kick it off to the next person.
Popcorn style, y'all know how we do.
Good evening. I am Tobia Dortoya. I'm currently a second-year chemistry graduate student at Howard University. So I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and spent my time growing up in the gorgeous Prince George's County of Maryland. My interest in cannabis is kind of, I guess I'm interested in all aspects. So policy making, whether it's also growth / retail, and just I guess health implications as well, because I have that science background.
Great, thank you. I'm currently in Landover, so new to Prince George's County, moved from DC to here. Really enjoying it.
That's where I went to middle school and elementary school.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
PG County.
Yeah.
Toby, who we popcorning to?
Oh, that's good. Scotty.
How you doing? My name is Scotty Johnson, resident junior in North Carolina Central. Raised in Atlanta. Cannabis interests are business and supply chain. Let's see. I'm gonna give it off to DeAndre.
Greetings, I am DeAndre Smith. I am a transfer student from Polk State College, pursuing my doctorate of pharmacy with a minor in food science at Florida A&M University. My interest in cannabis lies on policy making as well as distribution and manufacturing. I want to do it all. I want to change my community. I want to make my village better. I do a lot of things in real estate, and the only thing you can do, if you can't make your community a village, then you can't make anything happen. So, I just want to do that. And I like to popcorn on to Caleb.
Hello, my name is Caleb. I am a junior pre-med biology major at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm from South Carolina, and what I'm interested in the cannabis industry is just social equity and really research. I can't wait to see what comes out in like the next 10, 20 years. But that's what I'm interested in. And I'm going to popcorn it to Mark.
You're muted, my guy.
Mark, you muted.
Appreciate it. Good evening. My name is Mark Randerson. I'm an anticipating doctor of pharmacy candidate at my HBCU, Xavier University of Louisiana. And my cannabis interests are in research and the medicinal side of it, of course. What brings me to the ambassador program is really my personal use and being affected in my lifetime of seeing peers and family members affected by the school to prison pipeline. I think all of us have been affected by friends and peers being affected by drug policy and school administration and work administration. So I want to popcorn into who we got next. Hi, Angie. Hi, Angie. Introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. Even though my name down there says Angie, my name is Justin Merritt. I'm a incoming master's in biology student at Tuskegee University, focusing in immunology. And on the side, I do a little medicinal marijuana research with the phytochemistry lab. My interest in marijuana is research and development. I'm a trained biologist and a chemist, and I always like to try to investigate things and find the bigger purpose. And I see so many positive benefits that are available to come from marijuana, because our body has a whole endocannabinoid system which affects every facet of our body. I feel like as scientists and young people of the next generation, we do a lot in researching and finding better ways to use marijuana to help our body. And did I say everything I need to say?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And it looks like we have two others. Asila, sorry if I didn't say your name correctly.
Yeah, you were close. It's Asila, but hello everyone. So I'm a two-time, well, not grad, but two-time HBCU student. So I did undergrad at Fayetteville State University in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I'm currently at Southern University Law Center, going into my second year of law school. I'm the training and education coordinator of M4MM at our school, the chapter that we have. And my interest in marijuana is policy, along with cultivation, and just really learning as much as possible. It's very interesting to me to see how, just the upbringing that I had, how it was bad, and then learning all of the benefits. So I'm kind of just, soaking up all the knowledge I can.
Thank you. Eve? Eve, we're just doing introductions.
Sorry.
No
Hi,
worries.
my name is, can you guys see me or no?
No, but we can hear you.
Okay, hold on. Hi, my
Hi.
name is Eve Ellis. I go to Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a rising sophomore. I'm an independent film major, which is a major created by myself through the Spelman curriculum and also surrounding curriculums at Clark University and Morehouse College. And I'm a documentary film minor.
Great. I believe that's everyone. Yeah, okay, great. Thanks for those introductions. It was so inspiring to hear just your backgrounds and your interests. I love that this group represents really the diversity of advocates that we need to change policy. I heard chemists, scientists, people who are interested in public health, people who are interested in the business side of marijuana. This is all great. And really, why this is really exciting is because we always need really well-rounded advocates to help us push along policy. So I'm really excited to hear that you all are interested in marijuana and you have like these, varied reasons why, and varied like perspectives on it, which is really great. So that was really exciting for me as somebody who's always looking to engage more public health professionals and other non-policy folks into the conversation. This is great. But I'll just get right into it and tell you more about my day-to-day. Introduce you to the Drug Policy Alliance, but I also want to talk about current marijuana bills that have recently moved in Congress and will be moving soon. But before that, I thought it would be helpful to just tell you a little bit more about myself, tell you about my background and what really led me to this work. So I was born in Mexico, but raised in a rural small town in Nevada, middle of nowhere. The town was very interesting. Growing up, I always felt like an outsider, very conservative, small town that has a really heavy Mexican immigrant and Native American population, as well as a substantial white population. But I grew up in a place where I didn't see people of color reflected in any leadership positions. I'm talking, from being a teacher in the classroom, from being, on city council, we just weren't represented. And on top of that, there was a lot of really ugly, explicit racism that was very prevalent in the community. And again, it was just very explicit, very ugly. So from a very young age, I was very angered by that. And I was very angered by the fact that I understood that communities of color, Latino and Native American communities specifically, were being treated as second-class citizens, as less than. And I knew from a very young age that I wanted to do some sort of civil rights advocacy because of that. I remember just this feeling that I was being cheated in several ways, that my family was being cheated, that my community was being cheated. And all of that really led me to take an interest in politics from a very early age. And I remember, the first time that I learned about lawmaking was actually in my government class in high school. I happened to be in a government class that got special privileges because it was an honors class. And my government teacher organized a field trip to DC. And I remember really wanting to go on the field trip, but also remembering that we couldn't afford it. And I told my teacher that, I really want to go, but my mom says there's no way she can pay for me to go all the way to DC. So he offered to find me a scholarship and bring me to DC, which I was very, very grateful for, because that really solidified my career trajectory, I think, for me, because it was in DC where the first time I got to, visit the Hill, which is Congress, right? Visit with lawmakers and just learn about how laws are created. And I was really inspired by that because as I shared, I always wanted to do civil rights work. So, I took that with me when I went to college, and in college, I made the decision that I would be a lawyer and go to law school. I knew that that's what I wanted to do because, again, on my DC trip, I had met many lawyers who were writing laws. After college, I took a break before law school in order to really think about what type of civil rights I wanted to practice. And it was during that time where I really started to dig into criminal justice, and I started to see criminal justice as a civil rights issue. I think now you might hear people talk about criminal justice reform, and it's become more mainstream. But when I was entering law school, that wasn't really the case. And that was only like 10 years ago. So it's, this conversation around criminal justice reform has become more mainstream, which I'm very thankful for. But I remember even 10 years ago, there weren't a lot of folks doing it, and it wasn't really seen as a bucket of civil rights work. But in law school, I did take advantage of different legal clinics, different legal journals, that sort of thing, different experiences to really figure out what kind of lawyer I wanted to be. And in law school, I learned that I still really much enjoyed the criminal justice work. During that time, I also experienced the incarceration of a family member, which really just solidified for me that this was the work that I wanted to do post-law school. So after leaving law school, I went to work at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. It's the sister organization of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, LDF. But their work is done through a Latino civil rights lens. And there I got to develop the first portfolio around criminal justice reform, which was really exciting for me. And after doing that work for about 2.5 years, and this was in DC, I moved to a think tank in DC called the Center for American Progress, CAP. So this is a think tank that just puts out position papers and also works with the Hill to educate them on different issues. And while I was at CAP, I really started to not just do the criminal justice work, but I really started to get into drug policy. And this is when I first really started to work with the Drug Policy Alliance on marijuana policy specifically. And I was at CAP for about 1.5 years. And then a position became open at the Drug Policy Alliance, this position actually. And I remember my former boss at CAP was like, I'm not trying to push you out of this organization, but he's like, I think this would be a great opportunity for you and you should really think about it. And I'm so glad that I took him up on his advice and applied. And, I've been at DPA now for almost 3 years. And it's kind of interesting for me, and I'll tell you guys a little bit more about DPA, but I came from the civil rights space, the criminal justice reform space. And a lot of that certainly applies to drug policy, but drug policy, it's also its own field. Like I never really had to think about the science or the chemistry or the public health aspects of drug policy. I thought about like the criminal justice piece, civil rights, and how, enforcement impedes civil rights. So that was a bit of a learning curve for me. And I feel like the Drug Policy Alliance is a place where I'm still learning because, again, I'm not somebody with a public health background. I'm a civil rights lawyer by training. So for me, it has been some catch up on that front, but it's very interesting. I find it all very interesting. And in fact, I'm kind of like wishing I would go back to school and get my master's in public health because I'm like, oh man, that would have been so helpful to have that perspective going into this work. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Drug Policy Alliance, it's a nonprofit that is working to end the harms of the drug war, the harms associated with drug prohibition. So we do our work through policy advocacy, but we also have a legal office that supports, cities and nonprofits that want to push the envelope on drug policy. And we also have a research department where they, look at research that's being produced on drugs, but they also produce their own research. And we all work collaboratively. But my office specifically is the DC based office. We're the Office of Federal Affairs. And we have the task of talking to Congress, which anybody who's like reading the news these days knows what a challenge that is. But we engage with Congress on all things drug policy. We also engage with the White House and the administration. And I think when people think about presidential administrations, they typically just think about the White House, but there are several important agencies that we work with all the time, like ONDCP, the FDA, NIDA. We're constantly following what HHS is doing, what DEA is up to, many agencies that we have to track because we've built a real big drug war apparatus. So, it really does require that we look at all areas of the federal government. So a lot of my job is just lobbying. It's advising Congress on legislation. It's writing legislation. It's building support for policy proposals. I like to think of us as the, lobbyists for the good side. And what's actually really neat about that is that, I think people hear lobbyists and they, think something negative associated with that. And I think most of the time that's true. There's a lot of scummy lobbyists out there. But in the marijuana space, what I find really interesting is that, there's now a lot of high paid lobbyists in the cannabis industry, but they're not as effective as DPA is or other organizations that I think are doing it for the right reasons, which I find really interesting because they definitely have more money than us. But I think, you really need heart to do this work and be effective at it. And I think that's what the Drug Policy Alliance certainly has. So that's a little bit about DPA. Just a quick overview related to the levels of government. I think this would help when we talk about law and policy. So I work at the federal level, and obviously, that means the three big branches, the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and federal courts, the administration, the presidency, the executive office, right? And then Congress. Mostly we engage with Congress and the White House. And by the White House, I don't mean just the president's office. I mean other agencies like ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, HHS, Health and Human Services. We have to always watch what the DOJ and the DEA are doing. So there's, a lot of different agencies that we're constantly talking to, watching out for, meeting with, that sort of thing. And then there's the state and local level. And I'm sure folks are familiar with that. It's the same thing for the most part, but just at a smaller level. I think something that, trips up a lot of people when they get to DC or that do the federal work, I think a lot of people get really tired from doing it because unlike the state and local level, at the federal level, it can take a really long time to change things. You know, it's very rare for a bill to pass one chamber of Congress. It's especially rare for a bill to pass both chambers and get signed into law, especially now when our government is becoming increasingly polarized. And that frustrates a lot of people. You know, I meet a lot of advocates who get burnt out and just want to leave DC as fast as they can and do something else where they feel they can have a bigger impact. And, you know, I think if you do want to do the federal advocacy, I think that's something to keep in mind. You just have to know it's going to be a long game, and you have to be okay with that. You know, you have to understand the system that you're working in. And I think I came to DC understanding that. Like, I always wanted to do the big national politics. You know, I understand that it's a longer runway, but I also know that the impact can be much bigger at the federal level if you can change entire systems across the country. So I'm okay with that. But I think a lot of people do find it frustrating. At the state and local level, which is, you know, it's very exciting that you guys are engaged, because you can really impact change quicker, I think, at the state and local level. You can really push your lawmakers or government agencies to do things a lot quicker than we can in DC. So I think either, you know, whatever direction people want to engage in, as long as you have like expectations around how fast or quickly things will move or slowly things will move, I think you'd be set. I think the most important thing is, though, that, you know, we stay involved and are active in our democracy. So now I think I'll move to talking about the MORE Act and really federal marijuana policy, and give you insight onto, you know, how the bill was created and why. So the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act is a bill that has been passed by the House twice at this point. Once in December of 2020, and then most recently this year in April 1st, actually. This bill really came together, I should say the idea for this bill really came together back in 2018. In 2018, the Drug Policy Alliance started to see the writing on the wall and knew it was only a matter of time before the federal government decided to deschedule and legalize marijuana. They wanted to make sure that when the government did it, they did it in a way that was fair and centered reparative justice. And the reason they were so adamant about that, we were so adamant about that, is because at this time we had seen some states already start to legalize marijuana or decriminalize marijuana. Going back to what I was saying earlier, you know, oftentimes at the state and local level, things move a lot faster than at the federal level. And I think marijuana is a perfect example of that, where at this point you have a situation where most states have loosened their laws around marijuana, but the federal government retains a very restrictive, actually the most restrictive law on marijuana. It's still a Schedule I drug. But what we also started to see is that as the states were decriminalizing and legalizing, they were leaving communities of color behind, people who have been most impacted by prohibition. So we wanted to make sure that when we built a law at the federal level, that we centered communities most impacted by prohibition, most touched by the war on drugs. We wanted to build a reparative justice bill, not just for the federal government, but we were also hoping that it could serve as a model bill for other states and localities if they decided to decriminalize marijuana. So I'm happy to walk you all through the bill components, because I actually think they're important, and we were very thoughtful and intentional with each piece of the bill. Another thing that we were thoughtful and intentional about was creating a coalition that represented a variety of stakeholders. So that led us to create the Marijuana Justice Coalition. So the Marijuana Justice Coalition first came together in 2018, and it's still convened by the Drug Policy Alliance. I'm the convener of the coalition, but it's inclusive of not just drug policy groups like SSDP, and Minorities for Medical Marijuana, but also civil rights groups, traditional civil rights groups, like the National Urban League, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. In addition to that, we have labor groups, we have social workers, we have people who have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. We really wanted to make sure that we brought in a wealth of expertise and experiences to help inform our bill. And that led us to the MORE Act. So like I said, I think talking through each of these components will be helpful, just so I can explain the intentionality behind each provision. So the first thing that the bill does is deschedule marijuana. So when we mean deschedule, we mean removing marijuana completely from the list of the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA. The Controlled Substances Act is how the government determines drug schedules, or in other words, like the restrictions around that drug. Schedule 1 drugs carry the most severe restrictions and the toughest criminal penalties. Marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug to this day, which to me is really wild, especially when we know that so many states have loosened their marijuana laws and decriminalized it. But it's still Schedule 1 drug. It's on there with heroin, LSD, ecstasy. It's treated as a Schedule 1 drug, which technically means that it has a high potential for abuse and it has no medical value. That's the definition of Schedule 1. And we know that that's not true of marijuana. We know that it doesn't actually, research shows that it does not have potential for abuse, and actually it could have medical benefits. We know that there are medical marijuana programs all over this country, but yet it remains a Schedule 1 drug. So the first thing the bill does is completely decriminalizes it. And again, I want to emphasize that it's descheduling, not rescheduling. And I say that because you have people like Joe Biden who say that he doesn't think anybody should go to jail for marijuana, but he won't say he supports descheduling. He says he supports rescheduling. So in other words, lowering marijuana to like Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 status, which to us is not sufficient, because we know that as long as it's on the schedule, criminal penalties will apply. So when he tries to say, I support decriminalizing marijuana, it's a lie. If he's not also saying, I want to deschedule it, he keeps saying, I want to put it on Schedule 2, which, Schedule 2 would mean that they admit that it has medical benefits, but it's not, and it's inaccurate to continue to say that you support decriminalizing the plant and then, on the other hand, won't support descheduling. So I think that's a very important point to make, especially because I think people sometimes get those confused. So it completely deschedules. Another thing that it does is that it changes the word marijuana in the federal code from marijuana to cannabis. And we had a lot of back and forth in the coalition about this, actually. You guys might hear cannabis being used more nowadays. And you usually hear it when, it's used in a professional setting or like a business setting. And that was a huge reason why the coalition had conflict with using that word. We thought, like, why, now that this has become professionalized and, now that all these white businesses are making billions of dollars off of it, why now are we calling it cannabis? When before we were okay calling it marijuana. And actually, there's a very problematic history behind using the word marijuana in the federal code. And that history comes from actually the first drug enforcement officer that the US had way back in the 1930s. He was looking to build out his department because, he thought that the department was going to lose all of its funding, because at the time, the drug war hadn't been created. So for the most part, drugs were not criminalized. But in order to criminalize more substances and get more funding from the government, he started to look at ways to criminalize different substances. And marijuana was one of the first substances. At the time, there is, like today, there was a lot of conversation and a lot of conflict around immigration. So he thought, why don't we call cannabis, stop calling it by its scientific name and instead call it marijuana, to associate it with the Spanish word for cannabis, marijuana, and to make that association with Mexican migrants. So it was a specific use of that word, a racist use of that word, xenophobic use of that word, in order to target Mexican populations and deport Mexicans from the US. And it worked. The federal code literally says marijuana to this day. So we thought it was really important to change that in order to address the racism behind using that word in the first place. But at the same time, we don't want to start to call it cannabis, because we also think that's whitewashing the term. We still say weed, we say marijuana, we don't say cannabis, but we do think it should be removed from the federal code. So maybe those messages are a little conflicting, but we did have our reasoning for it. So descheduling, changing the name to cannabis in the federal criminal code. Another big aspect of the bill is that it expunges and resentences cannabis convictions. And of course, we all understand why this is important. We know that despite more states loosening their marijuana laws, marijuana still remains a huge reason that people have contact with the criminal justice system. And, you know, I'm not even talking about going to jail or serving a prison sentence. I'm talking about just giving the cops another excuse to harass people, because we know what that could lead to. So for us, it was really important that we address that fact, the fact that to this day, more than 500,000 people are arrested every year for cannabis violations, for marijuana violations, even in states that have decriminalized to some extent. So we cannot ignore that, especially when we know the history of racist law enforcement in this country and the, you know, the way that laws are selectively enforced against communities of color. So for us, it was really important to have that. And we also know that marijuana specifically, if you look at, you know, who's serving time federally for marijuana, it's heavily Latino. And if you look at who is being arrested every day, it's heavily Black and Latino. We know actually that, you know, across demographic groups, people are using marijuana at similar rates, but Black people are about 3 to 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana law violations than white people are. So for us, it was really important to prioritize resentencing and fully expunging marijuana convictions. In addition to that, we create different funding streams. So the bill would tax marijuana and reinvest marijuana tax revenue into 3 different funds. One is the Community Reinvestment Fund. This fund would support social services and legal services in communities that have been most harmed by the war on drugs. We also have 2 funds that would support entrepreneurs who want to enter the industry or who want to just start a business, but have been impacted by the war on drugs. So this is why I call it a reparative justice bill, because it's trying to repair past harm. Another aspect of the bill is that it ends collateral consequences. So we all know that, you know, having an arrest or conviction record can have major consequences in a person's life. Actually, there are about 45,000 collateral consequences across the US that a person who has contact with the criminal justice system can be subjected to. So this means that they have a harder time finding housing or may not be able to find housing because of an arrest or conviction. They may not be able to go to some schools or get student loans. They may not be able to get federal benefits. There's a slew of them that just never end. And in some places they can't even vote, right? So we thought it was really important to restore rights, which is why expungement and sealing of records is really important and critical to the bill. But there are other collateral consequences as well. So for example, one of the collateral consequences that the bill addresses is immigration law. Marijuana itself continues to be the #1 drug that leads to deportation. If you're a non-citizen, even if you're engaging in marijuana in a way that's legal in your state or city, you can still face immigration consequences that can affect your immigration status, including deportation. And I'm not just talking about people who are undocumented. I'm talking about people who have green cards, people who maybe are asylum seekers and have some sort of status in the US. Any involvement with marijuana, even if it's legal in their hometown, can still subject them to harsh immigration penalties like detention and deportation. And that's because marijuana remains a Schedule I drug. Until marijuana comes off the drug schedule, there will be federal penalties for non-citizens. So we wanted to make sure to fix that and provide relief for non-citizens through the bill. And this is especially important now, especially as big states like California and New York are building out their legal programs, because you might be a non-citizen even working in one of these stores and not realize because you're working with a substance that's federally prohibited that you could face immigration consequences. You might be a patient who's partaking in the legal industry, but again, because you're a non-citizen, you may not know that there are federal impacts for that decision. And you know, I think a lot of people don't know, but unfortunately, it is a situation that happens. Deportation for marijuana is the 4th most common reason that people are deported, which is pretty wild. It's a lot of people each year. So we wanted to make sure that we address that in the bill as well. So that's pretty much the crux of the bill. I'm trying to think if I missed anything. I think I got all of it. Like I said, at this point, the bill has passed twice, including most recently this spring. I look at the MORE Act really as a drug decrim bill because the bill is very heavy on social justice. And you might have got that from what I just explained, all the bill components. But the bill was very light on taxing and regulations. Like we didn't really build out a tax and regulatory framework, but we did that intentionally because we didn't want the bill to get caught up in Congress over tax and regs. We wanted the bill to move swiftly, get support, pass the House, in order to just build support for marijuana reform. And that's exactly what happened. It built the framework for the Senate bill. So recently, last week, the Senate introduced the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. This bill is based off of the MORE Act. So it's the MORE Act plus tax and regulations. So I think about the Senate bill more as of a, more of a real legalization bill, whereas the MORE Act House bill is more of a decrim bill. Because to me, when you're talking about legalizing something, that's when you talk about taxing it and regulating it. It's regulations. So this bill is, the MORE Act plus is what I like to think. So this is another bill that our coalition is eagerly, we were eagerly awaiting for it. And now that it's out, our coalition is actually doing a very deep dive of the bill. And in fact, we're meeting tomorrow, and tomorrow we're going to have our first discussion over the bill. And after that, we're probably going to take the next couple of weeks or so to decide if we want to endorse the bill. It would be nice to endorse the bill because then that means we could start lobbying in the Senate around the bill. The House has had years and years and years to contemplate marijuana and vote on marijuana. They've had so many marijuana bills in the House that have passed the House, but the Senate is always a little tougher. They haven't introduced a comprehensive marijuana bill up until last week with the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. It's the first time that they've introduced a comprehensive bill on marijuana. So we have a lot of education to do. And in fact, the very first hearing on marijuana just occurred in the Senate yesterday. And that was a subcommittee hearing in the Senate. But before that, there hadn't been a hearing on marijuana. So we really need to hit the ground running and take advantage of August recess to meet with staff and explain the components of the bill and try to get their support behind the bill if the coalition decides to endorse the bill. Even if we don't endorse the bill, we're probably still going to be lobbying to get people to support comprehensive marijuana reform, even if it's not necessarily the bill, to support the elements of the bill that we like. But we have our work cut out for us because, again, the House has had a long time to think about marijuana, study it, contemplate it. The Senate has not, and the Senate is always very challenging. There's a lot of challenges with Congress, but in the Senate, a huge challenge is the fact that you have to get 60 votes in order for a law to pass that chamber. In the House, you just need a majority, and the Democrats have had a majority for the last two Congresses. In the Senate, we don't have 60 Democrats, and even some of the Democrats that we have, might as well be Republicans, or they're certainly not helpful to our side, right? So it's going to be a challenge. I am under no impression that this bill is going to pass this Congress, which is really sad to say. But again, going back to what I said earlier, as an advocate at the federal level, you have to be okay with that. Things move slow here. In fact, the MORE Act actually moves pretty quickly. It's very rare that any bill makes it through a chamber, let alone twice, let alone 2 years in a row. Like, that is rare beyond rare. So I feel like I got really lucky in my advocacy career, and I'm comfortable with the fact that the CAOA is going to be a longer, more difficult journey. I think what's going to complicate it next year is that it's very likely that Democrats will lose the House. So we'll probably have a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, but you guys know a Democratic Senate has not helped us, right? Like, we still have trouble passing anything through the Senate because we have Democrats who won't move on things, and we don't have 60. So we're going to have challenging chambers probably. And then we have a president who I already said earlier doesn't believe that marijuana should be rescheduled. So we have a lot of things, that we're up against. But our job is to continue to push. Like, this doesn't happen overnight. I think the federal government often looks at what's happening at the state and local level. So I love to see that there's been drug reform at the state and local level. But we are also, advocates at the federal level. We have to educate, we have to push, we have to be watchdogs. It's all part of the work. It's not always fun, and it's very frustrating a lot of the time, but it's what we have to do. So I'm hoping that, next year we'll reintroduce the bill, an improved version of the bill in both chambers, and then we'll see what happens. But it'll be an interesting time, to see what actually goes down next year with the new Congress. So before I wrap up, I just wanted to talk about, some lessons that I've learned and, some challenges that I've also experienced, being, like a younger, I used to say young, but now I don't feel so young. So a younger person of color, woman of color specifically in this space. I would love to share that because, obviously you all are very interested in this topic and are leaders at, to some degree. And if you have an interest in this, I imagine you're going to want to do some sort of advocacy or take on some leadership roles. So I hope what I share is helpful to you. But, I think there certainly have been a lot of challenges, especially in DC, that's still very white male dominated. I think a lot of the time, especially when you're younger, people might not take you as seriously. But one thing that I have found to be true is that if you just, do the work, like the work speaks for itself. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think it's just so interesting that the cannabis industry now has so many lobbyists all over DC. Like I see them all the time, like, they look like what you imagine in your head, like all of that, but they're also just so ineffective. Nobody's calling them to get their advice on things, like when members of Congress want advice on the direction of a bill, or, when they want a sounding board or like a gut check, they call us, they call me, they ask for, that guidance. So I just think it's very interesting because, I feel like a lot of DC and a lot of maybe the world is just like kind of faking it. And I think those folks are the ones who don't really make an impact. I think if you are just yourself and you do the work speaks for itself, and you don't have to be anyone but who you are, is what I have found in my experience. And then, there's also challenges that come with leading a coalition. And I've definitely have learned some lessons. I think one thing to be mindful of, especially when you're doing policy, is you really want to think about all the different people who might be impacted by that policy. And a perfect example of this is the first year that we passed the MORE Act. So the first year that we passed the MORE Act, I was just very focused on the coalition, and whatever the coalition wanted, I would make sure that the coalition members knew everything that was happening on the Hill. I would give them the updates. Like I just kept everything to the coalition. But some problematic things got added to the bill as the bill was going to the floor, because this is what always happens. Lawmakers will horse trade on different things, and they'll like negotiate on different things. And as an advocate, you don't really have a lot of control over that. These are things that happen in order to get the bill passed. And I remember the first time that we passed the MORE Act, we were in a situation like that, where all this, not all of this, there were maybe 2 bad provisions that were added to the bill that we really didn't like. I talked to the coalition about it. I gave the coalition a heads up. I did not talk to other stakeholders outside of the coalition about it. But then what ended up happening is when the bill passed and people found out about the language, they were very upset and came for DPA, came for me. They're like, we were blindsided. Like, how do we not know this? And I really did learn an important lesson there, which is you got to kind of have to talk to everyone. I remember thinking these other folks who are in the industry or who do this, that's not my constituency. My constituency is people who have been directly impacted and the coalition. That's what I saw it as. And I still do believe that to this day. Like, I'm doing this work for impacted people. But, when you do this work, you want to get support, you want to build allyships, because those relationships are helpful to moving your policy forward. And I didn't like that some people felt alienated and caught off guard, because then that blowback does not reflect well on the organization. It does not reflect well on me and my leadership or on the coalition. So that was like a hard lesson that I had to learn. And I've been way more intentional about it now. So I have been building alliances that feel unnatural to me, or, that I definitely wouldn't have thought about like a couple of years ago. But because of that harsh lesson learned, I know now, I have to build a big umbrella. And sometimes the umbrella includes people that I don't feel naturally aligned to, like maybe people in the industry. But it's part of the work and you have to do that. It's really important that you do that. What other challenges? I think, the other challenge is just making sure that you're communicating everything to the coalition. I think I do a good job of that now, but that's only because when I was first doing this, you stumble. And there are times where you don't get it right, where you don't read everybody in initially. But I've learned that when you do coalition work, it's really important that you read everybody in and that you establish the work around a set of principles and values. And we actually have principles and values written down. People have to agree to them to join the coalition. And we're very transparent about the processes for how a coalition makes decisions. So all of that is really important in order to build trust in the coalition and for people to trust your leadership. So the last thing I'll say, and then I'll happily will answer questions. I just want to plug the Drug Policy Alliance and the fact that we have internships. So we have internships in all of our departments, in our legal department, in our research department, and in our advocacy departments. So not only do we have a federal office, but we have a California office, a New York office, and then we have a national office that works at the state and local level on policy. And then of course, my office, the Federal Affairs Office, that does the work with Congress and the administration. I would highly recommend that you look into our internships, especially if you're interested in this. I think you would learn a lot. And not just about marijuana, we do all drugs. Our huge priorities right now are marijuana legalization, drug decriminalization, fentanyl, and trying to minimize criminalization of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. But we also work on harm reduction. So in other words, providing health services to people who use drugs, making sure that people have access to medication-assisted treatment, fentanyl test strips, naloxone. We want to see overdose prevention centers and syringe service programs. These are all things that help people who use drugs have stable lives and stay alive, actually. So we do a whole range of work. We do criminal justice reform work. So another area of work that I lead is around policing. So policing bills at the federal level, sentencing. So we do that. And then on top of that, we do the drug policy and the public health policy. So if you're interested, highly recommend that you check out our internship programs. The different departments hire for different seasons. My department hires for each season. So summer, spring, and the fall. In fact, we're looking for a fall intern now. We do pay our interns unless you're getting school credit. Unfortunately, if you're getting school credit, you get school credit. If you're not getting any credit, we pay interns. So just check us out, follow us. And even if you don't get the chance to work with us, stay engaged with the Drug Policy Alliance. If you go to our website, you can sign up to get our newsletters. And that will, you'll keep in the loop of like the work that we're doing. But I hope that no matter, where your careers take you, that you remember that your voice your voice in doing this advocacy is really important, not just because, at the beginning I said you guys have very diverse backgrounds and perspectives. Yes, that's true. And we need more people of public health, science, business, like all of that. We need people from those perspectives. But I think what makes you more powerful is actually just talking to your friends and your family members. Those are the hearts and minds that we can most easily change, because they're going to trust what you say more so than they're going to trust what a lawmaker or a politician says, or like somebody on TV says, a talking head. So just remember that, do your, the work, the advocacy work can look different, but you can have a huge impact within your own communities, and that also affects change. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer questions. I'm really terrible at multitasking, so I couldn't read what was in the chat, but maybe now we can get into that.
I have a question. This is Eve.
Sure.
Well, I know, first off, just thank you for your entire presentation. It was very helpful, and I took a lot of notes. And I'm from DC, and I'm here now. So like a lot of the times that you mentioned it, and like the places, like 9 times out of 10, I've either like passed them or like been to them. So, but my question was, I know that the advocacy work can get not tiring, but it can definitely be stressful. So in the times that you receive like pushback, what are some things that motivate you, or like what's a part of your like mental health routine to really not gain your passion back, but just like get that momentum going again?
Yeah, I really love that question. What I love too is I feel like this generation is more conscious of that, because I feel like I'm always getting the questions about mental health, and I love that. I think that's really great. And in DC, it's a specific like environment. Like people who live here feel it. Like people who work here, I think really feel it. It's like a stressful, toxic environment. You know, I think we've all probably felt that over the last few years, and just like the wild stuff that's happening all over the world and in the US specifically. But like you feel it here like harder. I don't know how to explain it. I think it's the fact that we just have to watch what Congress does all the time. So everything like just like feels more personal, and it is exhausting. But I think it's like what I said at the beginning, it's like you just have to have the mindset knowing what you're getting yourself into. Like I always knew it's going to be really hard, and it's a long journey to like enact change at the federal level. So that's part of it. But you know, a reason that I shared my background is because it's led me to be the person I am today. Like I care deeply about communities of color, communities that have been marginalized and impacted by, you know, US messed up laws. And I feel like that's what keeps me going. Like I just deeply care, and I can't turn it off, thankfully. But it is important to recharge. So what helps me is like taking breaks. You know, I use my PTO. Like if you have paid time off, take it. Like take breaks. You need that to recharge. My guilty pleasure is watching garbage TV. I love all of the trash TV ever, because, you know, a lot of my work is like, you have to like pay attention and like be on it. So I just love to like turn my brain off and like watch Housewives and like, you know, just like watch stuff like that. You know, I totally love that. So definitely take time for things that make you happy. Another big part of my routine is I make sure I work out because I enjoy it. And otherwise I feel like I'm just like sitting at my computer all day. So I enjoy like movement and blowing off steam. So it's important to like keep a routine.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I have a few questions.
Sure.
I dropped one in the chat. So the first one that came to mind when we were talking about expungement. I know I think certain states had like expungement with a criteria. Would your not with your, but with this act, would it be expunging all cannabis infractions or like charges, or is it like because I know sometimes it can get twisted into like RICO charges if you're, say, supposedly part of a gang, drug trafficking, et cetera, et cetera. So like,
yeah,
what is the balance of that?
That's such a great question. So when we wrote the bill, the MORE Act, we did not want to put any carve-outs around who would be eligible, because what Congress likes to do, and I'm sure this happens at the state and local level, is like they like to like carve people out of relief. So they'll say things like only nonviolent offenses or only low-level offenses. And really that's all garbage, because prosecutors have so much power to decide where the crime should fit. So we wanted to make sure that there was no restriction on expungement relief or resentencing relief. Unfortunately, we were not successful with that in the MORE Act. We fought really hard, but they ended up restricting relief to nonviolent marijuana offenses, which was garbage, because we're like, all marijuana offenses are inherently nonviolent, but you guys are just throwing that in there and it's just creating more stigma. It was like so like not necessary. And on top of that, with expungement, they limited expungement to only certain offenses. So people with higher charges, because they were supposedly involved in a conspiracy, would not be eligible. We fought back so hard on that, but the House would not move on it. But the good news is we convinced the Senate to take it out. So in the Senate, there is no restriction. Like they took nonviolent out. Like they understood that it was problematic, but also dumb to put it in there because it actually has no legal effect. It was just, you know, another way for Congress to like say that they only support nonviolent offenses versus violent offenses. And that would take me into like a whole new different thing, but it's very problematic. Anyway, so they took it out. And in the Senate, and on top of that, for like the one that they had for like the higher traffickers, they could be eligible for expungement. It would require another hearing, but they could be eligible. But we only got that in the Senate bill because we pushed back on them really hard. And we didn't want that in there in the first place. We think everyone should be eligible for expungement and resentencing, no matter what your conviction is. Yeah. See, Asila has her hand up.
Hello. So the question that I had was, for the MORE Act and the CAOA, does it address whether cannabis policies affects like someone's Second Amendment rights? Because I've been seeing those issues throughout the South, like in Louisiana, and I know they just legalized marijuana for medical reasons. And I think I might have seen it in North Carolina, and they're kind of on the verge of doing the same. So I just wanted to know if they touch bases on that.
That's a really good question. And that was something that I hadn't even thought of until recently. Like I never thought about that connection. But yeah, in a lot of places, if you have a felony conviction, then you can't have a gun. And I think about a friend and advocate of mine, Weldon Angelos. He actually was imprisoned for selling marijuana. And at the time he was legally carrying a firearm. Like he didn't brandish it. He wasn't using it. He was just carrying his firearm that he legally purchased. But because he was selling small amounts of marijuana and he had a gun on his person when he did that, they ended up charging him an extreme amount. He got a 55-year mandatory minimum sentence. And it was so extreme. Yeah, it was so extreme that the judge was like, I don't want to do this, but like I feel like I have no choice. And it got the attention of Republicans and Democrats. And actually under the Obama administration, he was resentenced. Somehow, he still hasn't really shared how, but somehow to this day, he got relief, got out, he got a full pardon, and he started his own organization called Mission Green. And now he's an advocate. Actually, just yesterday, he was testifying at the hearing. Yeah, so he's someone that I lift up all the time because it's just like an example of how like wild all of this is. But yeah, if you can, if you just Google him, I'm sure you can find his story online. But he's an amazing advocate and somebody who's working to end harsh criminal penalties and try to right a lot of these wrongs. But anyway, so I just thought about his case when he asked that question. But I do believe the CAOA does address that. I would have to go back and like look to double check, but I do remember seeing language around that. And the whole point was that we wanted to make sure that those convictions would no longer, hurt your other rights. So if you're somebody who has an arrest or conviction, the bill should grant you relief. And if you have that relief, that should also mean that you should have access if that's what your state allows.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Looks like DeAndre's next.
Yes. So this actually segued really perfectly into my question. I actually did talk to a good friend of mine, Crystal Bush, and we were just talking about how a lot of companies make money off of marijuana actually being illegal, especially like Big Pharma, because now they're not competing with marijuana, and also the criminal justice system again, because the federal government gives money for every person to incriminate. So how do you feel like that's more the big, and you also alluded to this as well, as you're saying a lot of people are in these positions, but they're really stagnant because of other things and powers that be that are there. So do you mind talking about just how Big Pharma and criminal justice is making so much money off of this being illegal and how that come into play with it staying in its course?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's such a good point that you raise. We know that the big cannabis industry, like the big players, they want federal prohibition to remain in place. They don't want competition. They're like owning the market right now and they want it to stay that way. So that's definitely like a huge obstacle for any sort of reform. But actually what you said about the federal government making money, I've actually thought about this a lot, not just in the marijuana space, but in the fentanyl space. In the media, you've probably seen a lot of news about fentanyl, and a lot of it is not true. For example, there's been news saying that if you touch fentanyl just through your skin, like you're overdose. And like, that's not true. You can't overdose from fentanyl like that. You have to inject it Like it has to be in your system. And no, you cannot ingest fentanyl-laced marijuana, because that's another thing that we've been hearing. Yeah, these are not facts. But the news is reporting it like it's facts, and law enforcement is reporting it like it's facts. Like they're circulating these videos of their officers overdosing when they touch fentanyl, but that's just not true. It's just not how it works. But I think a lot of the reason that they do that, and a lot of the reason they like to like pose with like all these drugs that they found and be all big about that, is because they want their money. They want their police budgets to continue to get filled to the brim. I think that's really what's inspiring a lot of this, you know. Not all law enforcement. There's an organization called LEAP. LEAP is LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And it's, you know, all people with law enforcement background who like have changed their tune on the war on drugs. So now they're like trying to end the war on drugs. And it's really interesting because, you know, people on the Hill really listen to them. Members of Congress will listen to them because we give the police a lot of authority in this country. But I think about that all the time, just how like the government is profiting, the police is profiting majorly from the war on drugs. And I definitely think that's a huge incentive for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. So I had two questions, but the first one, I guess, is a follow-up of Asila's question. Because I am a little unclear, but I know in the state of Maryland, if you have a gun license, you forfeit the right to getting a marijuana license. So in that CAOA, does that address like the difficulties, or not difficulties, but restrictions of potentially having both, or is it addressing potentially say you had a prior conviction due to guns?
That's really interesting. So to the first part, I've never heard of a law like that. I didn't know that about Maryland. That's really wild to me that you can't have both. We don't address situations like that. Both bills leave decisions around marijuana prohibition up to the states. So it would, like, state law would still take precedent, but it would just eliminate federal criminal penalties and other federal penalties. So it wouldn't speak to that, but it does speak to like other charges that people may have. So if somebody, so for example, like the person I brought up, Weldon, he would have relief under our bill because he was charged, he had a stacked charge. So they didn't just get him, ultimately they got him for the marijuana sales, but it was because he had underlying gun charges. But under the bill, somebody like him would get relief. And if you had a previous charge and then you got a marijuana charge, and and that second time was what led you to have a prison sentence, you would have to have a resentence, and you would probably get out because marijuana is now legal. So you wouldn't have to serve that second sentence for marijuana. So we did try to address that, but it gets complicated.
And last question,
Mhm.
I'm personally interested in getting into the cannabis industry in Western Africa because that's my motherland. And especially after the UN suggested or promoted like the decriminalization of marijuana globally, there's been a lot of movement. What would you say, or what advice would you give to someone who's trying to get into similar work as you, and a space that it's like ground zero?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think following drug policy organizations is a good start. That way you can keep up with like what's going on. So yeah, follow the drug policy alliance, DPA. I saw somebody put our website in the chat. SSDP is another good one. Students for Accessible Drug Policy. I heard that there's people from M4MM here, another good organization to follow. There's also an outlet called Marijuana Moment. So they report on marijuana news. They're a good one to follow. They report on all things marijuana. But I think just starting to like understand like what the issues are, who the players are, and building connections like that is a good way to start. It sounds like you're already doing that. If you knew about today and you're already involved to some capacity, I would say just keep that up. But yeah, I think just following these organizations, keeping up with the news, coming to things like this is how you meet people in the space.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Great questions. Great questions. Anybody else?
I'll go just for the sake of time. So as you're here, another thing a really good point that you mentioned earlier, you're talking about how you receive backlash for not including others into your idea. But also if you include others into your idea, you also get the risk of them having an opposition on it and then picking it apart. And again, you have so many people that don't really agree with you, don't want to agree. How do you go with holding your guns and just still keeping the credibility and keeping your work secret until it's time to present?
Yeah, it's a constant challenge. It's a constant challenge. So that first time I talked about, that was something that I contemplated a lot was, if I come out and like tell other people aside from the coalition about like these bad provisions that were added in, are they going to organize to try to kill the bill? Because we already had a lot of people trying to kill the bill for other reasons. So that was definitely a real fear I had. But you know what? That ended up happening anyway. When the language did come out and they did see it, they ended up trying to kill the bill, and they had these backdoor meetings with lawmakers anyway. I wish I would have instead come to them first and given them a heads up. It probably would have like softened the blow. They probably wouldn't have like been as panicky. So yeah, in retrospect, I should have come to them and just given them that heads up. But I didn't have the relationships then to do that. It would have been weird, but I've worked on that since then. But it's hard, like even now with the Senate bill, or even now when the House bill passed this year, again, Congress was trying to add some bad stuff in there. And they told me, don't tell the coalition, like explicit direction from the House Judiciary Committee not to tell the coalition, because they didn't want people to be up in arms. And I'm like, well, I will tell them unless you fix it. And what they were trying to do was add really problematic immigration language. And I ended up just telling the immigration groups in our coalition, and I'm like, hey, can you guys take a look at this language? House Judiciary Committee wants to add it. They told me it's not bad. And then they're like, no, this is really bad. We cannot put this in there. So we secretly worked around the committee. And before the committee hearing that would decide whether the bill would go to the floor and what would be finally like the finality of what would be included in the bill, we organized and did outreach to those committee members and let them know, like, hey, just so you know, when this problematic language comes up, vote it down. So sometimes I have to do things like that, but it's always a crappy position to be in, because on one side you have the influential lawmaker who's like, you better not say anything. And on the other hand, I'm like, well, I cannot not tell the coalition, especially the coalition members who are working specifically on this issue, because that's just not good leadership. And I feel like that's shady. And I will never do something for like just the sake to get I will never do something just to get a bill through. Like the bill has to lead with conviction. It has to be like the principles and values of our coalition. That's really important to me. Not important to everyone, but it is important to me. But it was a similar situation even with the CAOA. When the bill was coming out, Senator Schumer's office reached out and was like, I'm going to give you the bill ahead of time. Don't share with reporters. Don't share with the coalition. But like, I can't do that. So, I feel like if they're going to share your own risk. I did not share with reporters, but I did share with a handful of coalition members whose influence and opinion really matters to me. And I didn't want them to find out that the language is out there and I didn't share it, because that could also hurt me. They could also lose trust if they found out about a situation like that. But instead, by giving them a sneak peek, it helps build the relationship. And they're like, oh, like it builds trust. They think that they see me as a value partner, and they think that I value them, all of that. But it's really hard. It's really hard to like make those calls. But yeah, you just have to listen to your gut on a lot of these things. There's, it's the answer isn't always clear.
That's one thing I've been seeing too. Again, I was talking to my friend Crystal, and she does a lot with cannabis, and she was at the drug convention this weekend or something like that. And they were telling her not to talk about cannabis at all. And it just amazes me how they don't let people advocate the way how they want to, or say their story, because they want to suppress and have their way 100% all the time, and impose fear in people so change won't happen and they can have their way. So thank you for being a light and fighting for us.
Thank you.
Amazing questions, everybody. Maritza, just so you know, we have a handbook where we keep notes and terms. I have marked down rules and tips for enacting policy change. Number one, integrity. Number two, communicate, over communicate. And number three, consider everyone the bill or the rule will affect. I think that I hit like those top kind of three rules to make sure we're thinking about. I mentioned to you before the call, a lot of these students, they have different things going on their campus. They have aspirations even larger than just their campus or even the state level. So I think even with them being on campus this semester and gaining support from whether it's admin or other students, even considering some of these rules are, I think, very important as they go out and hit their campus.
Yeah, I agree. This was really fantastic, DJ. I was so happy to be a part of this. So thank you all.
Yes, absolutely. We appreciate you coming through. Everybody, I dropped Maritza's LinkedIn in the chat, so make sure you scroll up and grab that. My bad, I didn't pin it, but if you scroll up, you'll find it. If not, you have her name. You can find her pretty quickly on LinkedIn. Anything else you want to plug before you get out of here, Maritza? Again, we appreciate all the time.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. I think I did all my major plugs, but definitely stay in touch through LinkedIn. And again, we'd love to see you all at DPA. So consider an internship. I also forgot to mention we have communications internships. So if you're interested in like communicating to the public about these issues, we have a ton of different opportunities. The summer is when we do most of our big hiring, but some departments will do hiring in the fall and the spring, and mine does it year round. So I hope we stay connected. Kudos to all of you for being here and for just having an interest in this and for listening to something like this on an evening when I'm sure you all have a lot to do, or at least for me, like trash TV to catch up on. But this is really great. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Maritza. We're